Hi, this is the AI Storyteller. I'm Mark. The book we are interpreting for you in this issue is the short story collection, A Christmas Memory, by American writer Truman Capote. This book contains 3 stories, written at different times in Capote's life, all of which revolve around holiday memories, 2 about Christmas and 1 about Thanksgiving. Such stories closely tied to holidays are not a favorite genre among most writers. These stories either conclude with a cheerful and peaceful scene or deliberately use the holiday atmosphere to highlight the character's misery, with the narrative limited to the days leading up to the holiday, leaving little room for deviation. However, it is precisely because of this that Capote's collection stands out. The first story in this book, A Christmas Memory, has become well known to many Americans and even inspired a television series that won an Emmy Award. Since its publication, this collection of holiday stories has been a perfect Christmas gift for several generations of Americans and continues to sell well. Although 4 American authors received the Nobel Prize in Literature after World War II, only Ernest Hemingway and Capote became widely recognized among the general public. Haruki Murakami once sighed about his own lack of writing talent after reading Capote's work. Capote's most beloved books, apart from the exemplary nonfiction work In Cold Blood, are this book, A Christmas Memory. Normally, when we read novels, we can disregard the author's identity and experiences because the work itself has its unique vitality. However, this book is different. Capote's life was so fascinating that it greatly enhances the luster of this autobiographical book on another level. Capote was born in 1924 in New Orleans, in the American South. His mother was only 16 when she gave birth to him, and after discovering that her husband wasn't as wealthy as he seemed, she divorced him and went to New York, leaving this beautiful Southern girl to be fostered by relatives in a small town in Alabama. When Capote was 9 years old, his mother finally married a wealthy Cuban man and brought him to New York a few years later. The surname Capote actually came from his stepfather. In New York, Capote embarked on a different life. He started working at the New Yorker magazine at the age of 17 and gradually built relationships with editors, met artists, and began publishing his own short stories. Capote reached the peak of his career when he conducted an incredibly detailed investigation of a murder case and wrote the masterpiece In Cold Blood. During his heyday, Capote was a well-known figure in New York's high society. He drank at Marilyn Monroe's house, exchanged nude photos with the famous Andy Warhol, and even listened to Marlon Brando confide in him. He shamelessly declared, "I am an alcoholic. I am a drug addict. I am homosexual. I am a genius." He talked incessantly about himself, saying I, and people applauded and cheered. However, he later fell into depression and illness. When asked if love meant everything in life, he replied, "Yes, the problem is you have to keep looking for it, endlessly looking." Capote rolled in the world of fame and fortune throughout his life. People early on labeled him as a child prodigy, a crossover star, a self-destructive genius. In his later years, due to prolonged alcohol and drug abuse, his brain capacity had severely diminished. His last words before his death were, "It's me, I'm Buddy, I'm cold." As the spotlight of fame and fortune gradually faded, what did Capote mean by this last utterance when he was beyond redemption? And why did he refer to himself as Buddy? Capote's life was full of oddities, but even the strangest of individuals have the simplest of hearts, and this book, A Christmas Memory, will provide us with answers. The first story, A Christmas Memory, was written in 1956 and published in a fashion magazine called Mississippi. It tells the story of 7-year-old Capote and his distant relative, Miss Sook, who is planning their own Christmas. Miss Sook affectionately calls him Buddy, which is a term in English meaning a companion or brother. This term is their secret. Only this 7-year-old child knows that Miss Sook, in her 60s, calls him Buddy because seeing him reminds her of a childhood friend named Buddy who had long since passed away. The eerie atmosphere of using the name of a deceased child to address a young boy is self-evident. Miss Sook has never married, and she hasn't worked outside the home. In the large family in Alabama, which Capote came to despise and distance himself from, she was an outlier. In this heartwarming story, we discover that her behavior is childlike, shy, and kind, which doesn't match her age. In Capote's favorite work, The Grass Harp, we can also see that Miss Sook had no specific role in the family, and most people looked down on her, thinking her mental development was impaired, even a bit eccentric. As for Capote, his memories of that southern time are always intertwined with frustration. Even at a young age, he was proud, and due to his hatred and boredom with school, he often played truant and ran away from home. He couldn't grasp algebra, couldn't even recite the alphabet completely, and the school considered him mentally deficient, suggesting he be sent to a special school for troublesome children. Capote displayed a strong inclination toward homosexuality from a young age. He was good-looking, sensitive, and meticulous in his gestures. Miss Sook never considered issues of sexual orientation, and it was Capote's more feminine tendencies that provided her with great comfort in her loneliness. She often dressed Capote in old clothes she had collected, making him look like a little girl, and they both enjoyed this game. However, in this Christmas story, Capote doesn't mention this detail. Out of a writer's pride, although he lived most of his life as an openly gay man, he never explored homosexual themes in his literature. At the beginning of the story, on a late November morning, we see 7-year-old Capote and Miss Sook busy in the kitchen of an old house in Alabama. The heads of the household never make an appearance, and Capote only mentions, "They are too powerful and always make us cry." However, these powerful relatives never intrude into the kitchen. It seems like it belongs to the two of them alone. They don't seem to have any conflicts with their relatives either. It appears that the cracks in life are enough for them to live happily. The core plot of this story is quite simple. Miss Sook sees that the cold wind has arrived, and she is inspired to bake some fruitcakes for Christmas. This young and old pair scours the house to find $13 from under the bed, which is their entire savings. It might not sound like much money to us, but if you knew what Capote and Miss Sook were willing to do to save money, you'd realize it was a significant sum for them. They sweat flies in the big house during the summer, earning a penny for every 25 they kill. And Miss Sook even refrains from going to the movies to save money. A movie ticket costs only a nickel. They collect ingredients from various sources, first picking up leftover pecans from other people's orchards, then buying cherries, ginger, and vanilla, canned pineapple from Hawaii, candied peels, raisins, walnuts, whiskey, flour, butter, eggs, and spices. With all these ingredients, they spend 4 full days preparing 31 fruitcakes infused with the flavor of whiskey. However, as these two marginalized individuals, both shy and mysterious, with limited social interaction, even disliked by those around them, consider who to give the cakes to, Capote makes us feel the asymmetry between their goodwill and the cold reception they receive. They give the cakes to people they've only met once or have never met at all because the people around them don't really value their gifts. They even send a cake to President Roosevelt. When we see President Roosevelt, we can generally infer that the story is set during the Great Depression in the United States in the 1930s. This also explains why Capote and Miss Sook were questioned by the bar owner with a stern look when they went to buy alcohol. "What are you buying alcohol for?" In 1933, President Roosevelt repealed the Prohibition Act that had been in effect since 1919. However, state laws did not synchronize, and in the traditionally conservative American South, alcohol was still difficult to obtain. So, the bar owner eventually gave them a bottle of unlabeled moonshine, which strictly speaking was illegal. But in Capote's portrayal, this child and elderly woman seemed to be in a state of blissful innocence, where both legal and societal rules were in a distant place. The only significant conflict in the story occurs after the cakes are completed when Miss Sook and Capote decide to try a little of the remaining whiskey. Miss Sook faces harsh criticism from her family, who believe it's wrong to give alcohol to a child. Miss Sook runs into her room, crying inconsolably, and with Capote's comfort, she regains her spirits and plans to go into the woods the next day to cut a Christmas tree. As the story approaches its conclusion, amid their busy activities, the old house is filled with the perfect Christmas atmosphere, yet these two people seem forever out of place and run outside to fly kites. The kites symbolize Capote's impending departure, and this is their last Christmas together. Later, Capote goes to a military school where he is bullied by boys who consider him effeminate, while Miss Sook grows older and confused, unable to distinguish between him and the deceased Buddy. Eventually, as with all inevitable farewells, one day Capote receives word that Miss Sook has passed away. In the winter after writing this story, in 1956, Capote produced his first nationally renowned work, Breakfast at Tiffany's. Like his previous works, this novella still had autobiographical elements, blending his experiences with his mother's and his pursuit of fame in New York. At this point, he had seamlessly integrated into the upper echelons of Northern American society, even getting access to top-secret information about Marilyn Monroe's impending remarriage. In the winter of 1959, the celebrity Capote returned to the American South in Kansas. This time, he would face the most exciting challenge of his life: writing the groundbreaking In Cold Blood. We don't know how Capote would reorganize his memories of the South, but we do know he brought his childhood friend Harper Lee along for the journey. Lee was also a writer and would write To Kill a Mockingbird 2 years later, becoming a classic author even before Capote. Capote interviewed nearly everyone related to the case, took over 6,000 pages of notes, and finally completed this masterpiece in 1966. The book was serialized in 4 parts in the New Yorker magazine and broke weekly sales records. Ultimately, it was included in the list of the greatest American books of the 20th century. However, Capote's health deteriorated, and he fell into a state of confusion and despair. It seemed he had grown too close to one of the murderers, Perry, and couldn't forget him. At the execution site, when it was Perry's turn to be led to the gallows, Capote suddenly stood up and rushed out. He explained his relationship with the killer this way: "It's as if Perry and I grew up in the same house. One day he went out the back door, and I went out the front." This statement means that he saw a similar childhood in the murderer, and this time, while celebrating his own success, he knew how to empathize with the other. This is also why he was so deeply involved in Cold Blood. The second story included in this book, A Thanksgiving Visitor, was written 2 years after the publication of In Cold Blood, and it seems that the theme of troubled children still lingers in Capote's mind. We can observe some changes in the names of characters. In the earliest work, The Grass Harp, he gave Miss Sook a pseudonym. In the first story, A Christmas Memory, Miss Sook remains nameless, referred to throughout as my friend. It's only in the second story, A Thanksgiving Visitor, that she appears with her real name. This suggests that Capote was finally willing to embrace privacy and openly write an autobiographical story. For a significant part of his writing career, literary critics criticized him for lacking true fictional talent, as even in his novels, one could find real-life prototypes, sometimes with identical details. After successfully writing the nonfiction work In Cold Blood, it seems he could now face this accusation more openly. In the second story, Capote brings Miss Sook back to life. He starts doing things he deliberately avoided in the previous story, describing Miss Sook's appearance. Her face was special, fine and clumsy, her young, beautiful eyes revealing a kind of tenacity. He even gives up subtle characterization and directly narrates the character's traits. Miss Sook, who led a sheltered, inexperienced life, retained an innocence that rendered her incapable of comprehending pure malice. Here, the so-called pure malice is actually represented by a 12-year-old boy named Hudson, and Capote provides a clear description of Miss Sook's appearance and character traits with just a few strokes. This is because Hudson, Capote's classmate, is the protagonist of the story. Hudson comes from a very poor family, and during the Great Depression, he can only attend school wearing a sweaty, second-hand shirt, yet he is adept at fighting and all the other children fear him. Capote, who appears somewhat effeminate, is frequently bullied by Hudson. In today's terms, this is clearly a form of school violence. As Thanksgiving approaches, Miss Sook prepares a sumptuous feast and wants to invite Hudson to the family gathering. She feels that, on one hand, a child like Capote will eventually have to learn how to get along with rough, straight boys like Hudson. On the other hand, seeing Hudson's family's poverty, she wants him to have a happy Thanksgiving. Miss Sook considers herself a decent person. Even though she doesn't have much money, she still wants to wash the tablecloth until it's spotlessly clean. When she sees others suffering, she feels guilty. The only selfish aspect is that she doesn't know whether she should sell the brooch her father left her, so that young Capote can try his luck with that money when times are tough. However, while everyone is busy with Thanksgiving preparations, Capote notices that Hudson is planning to steal this brooch. Out of a sense of revenge, he doesn't stop the theft on the spot but waits until everyone is seated at the table, prayers have been said, and they are ready to enjoy the turkey, onion rings, and mincemeat pancakes before revealing Hudson's act of theft. At this moment, Miss Sook displayed the grace of a host. She went to check the room and, upon returning, rebuked Capote, saying, "My brooch was right where it was." Clearly, she didn't want this child to bear the reputation of a thief. However, this remark also stirred Hudson's pride. He thanked Miss Sook, took out the brooch, and placed it on the table, then walked straight out. At the same time, Capote felt hurt as well because, as a child, he believed that even in this family, his best friend wouldn't stand on his side and deliberately obstruct his revenge plan. So he seemed to be even more hurt and ran out of the house, even contemplating suicide. In this story, Capote's mastery of techniques imitating children's language and psychology is even more polished than in the previous one. But he contemplated running away from home and even suicide, but when night fell, he got hungry, saw the chicken legs, and forgot all about his misery. At this point, a central idea and the hallmark of a holiday story come into play. Miss Sook teaches him that there's only one sin that cannot be forgiven, and that's intentional cruelty. Hudson bullies Capote, which is simply the natural roughness of children, whereas Capote's secret plotting is intentional cruelty. Nevertheless, regardless of the outcome, Capote's retaliation ultimately yields results. From then on, at school, Hudson spares Capote. The following year, Hudson was expelled from school due to poor academic performance and bad behavior. The last time people saw him was when Capote and Miss Sook were tending to the chrysanthemums in the garden. Hudson displayed more characteristics of the lower class, working as a helper in a dairy. His muscles bulged on his arms, and his face had tanned to a reddish brown. He helped the two elderly people move the chrysanthemums, and Miss Sook gave him a few chrysanthemum stems. This exchange seemed to be a kind of ritual, foretelling that the class divide between the two would eventually solidify as the children grew older. One side expressed goodwill through physical labor, while the other side repaid him with something beautiful but useless. At the end of the story, the economic situation of Hudson's family did not improve. He was only 14 years old and already had to work as a helper in the dairy. By this time, 14-year-old Capote had been writing stories for 3 years. Miss Sook's words inevitably remind us of the story in Cold Blood. What is intentional cruelty? Dick and Perry killed the Clutter family to rob them, which is certainly cruel. But why did Perry put a pillow under the head of the young boy before killing him, making it look like he was sleeping? This detail attracted Capote to explore this unfamiliar soul. Perry's childhood is very similar to Hudson's. Impoverished, mistreated, and like Hudson, he bullies other children at school. At the same time, his sensitive nature makes him very proud and eventually leads to using violence to solve problems when he feels insulted. His growth experience, of course, just like Capote, who was abandoned from an early age, encountered intentional cruelty. But if someone could treat him with kindness, like Miss Sook, perhaps the kindness in his human nature would not be as simple as putting a pillow under a corpse. After savoring the warmth from a story that appears cruel, much like a Reader's Digest story, the third story in A Christmas Memory returns to the theme of Christmas. It was written in 1983, 2 years after his biological father's death, and Capote, at the age of 59, had just 1 more year to live. Perhaps realizing that he didn't have much time left, he returned to childhood themes once again. This time, he writes about a Christmas he spent with his biological father during his early years. Capote's relationship with his biological father was not harmonious. After his mother got married in New York, 12-year-old Capote once wrote a letter to his biological father, using an adult's tone, saying, "Everyone calls me Truman Capote, and if you also call me that from now on, I will be grateful." Later, After he became famous and wealthy, his father, who was struggling financially, wrote asking for assistance. Capote not only refused with harsh words but also mocked him. In the story titled A Christmas Memory, the father remains a distant figure, representing the affluent New Orleans, which is the opposite of Miss Sook's impoverished Alabama. The father lives in a mansion with a terrace, drives a convertible, and has a dozen girlfriends. He had been married 6 times before. He may seem like a winner in life, but he couldn't win the heart of his own son. Capote didn't like the spicy food of New Orleans and didn't want to celebrate the holiday with his estranged father. His father's ex-wives, apart from his own mother, were all wealthy widows who had grown too old to attract anyone else. This explains why Capote is his father's only child, as those women were past childbearing age. His father's wealth accumulation through these marriages was undoubtedly a shameful matter. Capote felt even more ashamed when he saw his father embracing and kissing women much older than him at the Christmas dance. Another painful aspect of this Christmas was that 6-year-old Capote had to admit that Santa Claus indeed did not exist. After the dance, his father busied himself decorating the Christmas tree and neatly arranging the gifts. All of this was observed by the sleepless Capote. He asked his father for a large toy plane, and after this wish was fulfilled, he immediately took a long-distance bus ride back to his beloved Miss Sook. This trip to New Orleans left him with a negative impression, leading to him never seeing his biological father again. He never promised to stay with his father, and that toy plane only carried his heart further away. However, Capote gave this story a warm ending, subtly letting us feel that beneath the surface of his father's glamour, he was also a person who used alcohol to numb his pain. For the sake of his son's momentary happiness, he worked hard to arrange gifts and spent a lot of money. At the end, Capote wrote that his father passed away the year before he wrote this story, and in his father's safe, there was a postcard written by his 6-year-old son, thanking him for the airplane and saying, "Hi Dad, I hope you're doing well, and I'm doing well too. I'm learning to fly a plane, and I can fly high soon. So, you must keep your eyes open and watch. Yes, I love you, buddy." Capote had one more year to live in 1983. By that time, due to alcohol abuse, he had severe liver disease, and his brain had already atrophied. After In Cold Blood, for nearly 20 years, he never wrote another book. He had been estranged from his childhood friend, Harper Lee, the author of To Kill a Mockingbird, who had written a timeless classic herself. Capote collected material for a long time, preparing to write a work that could compare to Remembrance of Things Past, but in the end, he only wrote 1 chapter. Because this chapter involved too much privacy of high society, many celebrities severed ties with him. So, to some extent, this unintentional A Christmas Memory became his last book. As if foreshadowing, the last 2 words of this last book are Buddy, and his final sentence is, "It's me, it's Buddy, I'm cold." This final story returns to the origin of all his memories, which is when he was just 6 years old. This ending seems to imply that he has forgiven the father who cast a shadow over his childhood, but this forgiveness comes with conditions. He can only contain this warmth when he remembers Miss Sook and uses the name Buddy, a term of endearment that belongs only to the 2 of them. What he can never forget is this elderly virgin in her 60s. Similarly, as a Southern writer, Faulkner depicted a heartless old spinster in A Rose for Emily, who poisoned her lover and hid his body for decades. Fortunately, Capote wrote these 3 short stories, introducing an image of an old woman in American literature who is both respectable and adorable, as innocent as an angel. It's as if Capote aimed to transport memories back to that era. In his writing, he intentionally used very simple, almost childlike language. However, this childlike language, due to its simplicity, created many peculiar language effects. For example, he likened blooming chrysanthemums to lions, described Miss Sook's hair color as peppery, and in a passage about cutting down Christmas trees in the forest, his language was vivid and colorful. In his eyes, there was lemon-colored sunshine, green branches, red berries, black crows, and colorful mushrooms around, as well as startled speckled trout and beavers repairing dams. When we read this, it's as if we, like the characters in the book, can smell the refreshing scent of pine needles and holly on a crisp morning. Capote passed away on August 25, 1984. On August 23rd, while flying from New York to Los Angeles, he had with him a children's blanket made by Miss Sook. This blanket, with its bright red base and many squares, had never left his side since his youth. If you were to visit the town of Monroeville, Alabama, today, you would find this somewhat old-fashioned blanket in the local museum, along with a peculiarly colored outfit made of red, yellow, blue, black, and even green fabric scraps. This was the clothing Miss Sook frequently wore during her lifetime, and in the novel, Capote referred to it as her patchwork dress. Although these items have faded over time, the childhood memories written by Capote throughout his life will forever retain their original warmth. To wrap up, this interpretation ends here. Let's recap the key points from this segment. 1. Capote was one of America's most beloved authors, and his A Christmas Memory is a quintessential holiday story that has enjoyed enduring popularity since its publication, making it a highly cherished Christmas gift. 2. Capote's writing had a strong autobiographical element, with many of his stories based on real-life events. Critics have criticized his lack of fictional talent, but this is precisely what makes understanding his works a key to appreciation. Knowing Capote's life can better help us understand and appreciate his storytelling. 3. Miss Sook, unlike typical portrayals of elderly women in literature, is both admirable and endearing, as innocent as a child. This is a rare character in American literature. 4. The 3 stories in A Christmas Memory were written at different stages of Capote's life, for various reasons, but each time he returned to his childhood, Miss Sook played a pivotal role in healing his traumatic memories. 5. Capote faced financial difficulties in his later years, and after In Cold Blood, he never published another full-length book. A Christmas Memory can be seen as his unplanned final work. The deliberate use of childlike language in this book created a unique aesthetic style. Well, that concludes the content for this episode. If you enjoyed my video, please click like, subscribe to my channel, and share it with your friends. Thank you.